This morning, that landmark ruling on abortion, the Dobbs decision now overturning Roe versus Wade. Texas House Chairman Brisco Cain is with us on what Texas Republicans might do next when they reconvene in January. And Democratic House Chair Nicole Collier on what options her party has from here. The state hearings over that massacre in Uvalde revealed maddening new details last week. But will any legislation emerge from it? One of our questions for the Republican chairman of the Senate committee, Robert Nichols. And a bipartisan bill on gun violence moving quickly through Congress now. Texas, though, so far resistant to it. So what would it take to change that?
Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley starts now.
Good Sunday morning to our viewers across the state. The nation this morning talking about Friday's landmark decision on abortion. This morning, we will discuss on this program what comes next in Texas, talking to state lawmakers from both parties. First, though, some of the headlines you might have missed in the past few days. Big city mayors in Texas are the latest to ask Governor Greg Abbott to call a special legislative session on gun violence. Mayors from more than a dozen of the state's largest cities sent a letter to Abbott. They want the legislature to debate universal background checks, red flag laws, and raising the age to buy assault weapons. Abbott, though, has so far refused to call lawmakers back to Austin. We watched federal legislation on gun violence move quickly through Congress. This is the bipartisan bill that Texas Senator John Cornyn helped negotiate. It incentivizes states to enact red flag laws, among other things, and it is the first bill of its kind to pass Congress in 30 years. And almost a month after the election, the recount is complete. Congressman Henry Cuellar narrowly defeated his primary challenger, Jessica Cisneros. This is in South Texas. Cuellar, a conservative Democrat, 45,000 votes cast. He won by 289. Let's begin this morning, though, with that Supreme Court ruling that shook the country. Roe versus Wade is now history. Many Democrats say they never expected this day would come where states could decide abortion law. In Texas, Democrats are vastly outnumbered, as we know. So this weekend, they are looking at their options. Our first guest, a Democratic member of the Texas House, State Rep Nicole Collier from Fort Worth, who represents parts of Tarrant County. Madam Chair, welcome to the program. I want to ask you basically, first thing, where were you when this decision came down? Secondly, your first reaction to it.
Well, I'm here in Fort Worth, and my initial reaction is that it's devastating to the state of healthcare in America. It's a devastating blow to access for healthcare.
And of course, the Democrats are outnumbered, vastly outnumbered in the state Senate and in your chamber as well, too, the Texas House of Representatives. Where does that leave you when lawmakers return to Austin in January as far as trying to do something for women and your constituents?
Well, we've been trying. This last legislative session, we tried to fight off, very harmful legislation that would impact access to healthcare. And so where we are right now is with the trigger law. I mean, it's going to be banned in Texas. Basically banned, with no exception for rape or incest. So when we go back, unless we can get the voters out to, change the outcome of these elections, to elect more people who share their views, we're going to see more of the same and limited access to health care.
Madam Chair, let me ask you about that, because we've been kind of, talking around the table about that as well, too. How do you expect that this decision that came down from the Supreme Court on Friday morning, how do you expect that is going to impact the November elections, if at all?
Well, I sure hope it does, put people in motion and make them have more drive to turn out at the polls. What gets me is during the pandemic, we had the access to the vaccine, and so many people reached out in the state of Texas saying, my choice, my body. I don't want to have to take the vaccine. Don't make decisions over my body. And yet they support a law that would do just the same for those who do not share their views. So it's just, something that where people have to look at the situation and use their vote as their voice on where they stand on this issue.
But barring some seismic outcome in the November election, Democrats really don't have a shot at changing anything come next year, do they?
Well, the cards are stacked against us, but it's not impossible. There are pathways to success for Democrats. If we could mobilize and get those voters out, get them, those that came out in the last general election and the general election before that, and then capture all these new voters that have been registered. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of new voters that have been registered to vote, people who have been registered to vote. And if they show up, it's about showing up. And if we can get them to show up, we can overturn and turn around these elections.
How do you think the decision on Friday morning might change the Democratic strategy as far as getting out the vote?
Well, people need to know that elections have consequences. When we elect people who put those in place who don't share our views, this is what happens. We get policy that is not helpful, that limits our access. So hopefully people will look at the situation and say, I'm going to vote. So hopefully Friday's decision is a wake-up call. It's got to be. It's got to be that wake-up call to get you activated and motivated to move.
We've talked to some of your House colleagues, and they say among the things that they might consider introducing next session is a way to punish companies that pay for their employees to get abortions out of state. What's your reaction to that?
Well, that's just big government. I mean, if you want to talk about limited government, then talk about something else. But if you're talking about expanding government, that's what those policies do. They expand the hand of government and they invade the private actions of businesses.
Madam Chair, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
So that ruling on Friday is not the only big political news happening in Washington, D.C. Also, a bipartisan bill that quickly passed the U.S. Senate the other day to address gun violence. Texas Senator John Cornyn, a key negotiator in it. Then on Friday afternoon, the U.S. House just passed that bill as well, too. Ian Mitra is the senior managing editor at the Texas Tribune in Austin. Ian, welcome back to the program. This bill that just passed that is likely headed to the president's desk, it enhances background checks. It incentivizes state to enact red flag laws, among other things. Texas leaders, the Republicans in charge, have been cool to this, resistant to it. Do you see that changing at all, though?
Yeah, and this also obviously came up a few years ago after the Santa Fe shooting. The governor kind of talked about maybe there should be some consideration of a red flag law. It was that the idea of a red flag law was met with considerable resistance among the Republican leadership and lawmakers, and so it didn't go anywhere. And I see it's with this new law, which doesn't which provides some potential funding for initiatives like red flag laws. There doesn't seem to be any kind of push for this among Republican leadership this time. Yeah. And it's going to be hard to see that moving forward, although there have been obviously renewed calls for it.
Yeah, indeed. So 6 months until the legislature returns to Austin. I am back to you in a moment here. Thank you. Right. Coming up, speaking of Texas Republicans, they are planning to further tighten abortion laws in this state when they reconvene in January. Our conversation continues on abortion with Texas House Chairman Brisco Cain from Houston. Inside Texas Politics, back in a moment. Welcome back to Inside Texas Politics. It is now up to district attorneys across the state to enforce anti-abortion laws. Texas has statutes on the books from before 1973 that were never repealed, so those immediately become enforceable again. But will local prosecutors comply? State Rep Brisco Cain is already looking at ways to tighten Texas law around abortion. He is a Republican who lives in Deer Park and represents parts of Harris County. Mr. Chairman, welcome back to the program. Thanks for being here. Let's look forward to January of next year. What do you expect that you or your Republican colleagues might introduce that would further restrict or tighten abortion law in the state?
The legislature, my plan and from conversation with other legislators is to continue to, ensure that these laws are prosecuted. So of course, it's up to local DAs whether they prosecute these crimes. And we've been in discussions with ideas of whether we allow, neighboring DAs to prosecute these crimes if that DA says they're not going to. So there's ideas like that on how to do it, and also to go after those accomplices, those assisting others in getting abortions, maybe outside of this state. Now, in the opinion today in Dobbs, Justice Kavanaugh in a concurrence said he believes that, maybe punishing women for going out of state would violate the Interstate Commerce Clause. For one, that's dicta. That's not an opinion of the Supreme Court. But two, I think there are ways to go about that to have it accomplished properly.
So we're talking about potentially allowing DAs to prosecute doctors who aren't in the same county How would that work? Because you'd have to essentially overturn or move out of the way an elected official, duly elected official, right?
Well, look, I guess that's how that would work. I mean, that's the idea, and we're going to go for it. It's also, it wouldn't just be doctors. So under Article 4512.2 of the pre-Roe statutes, so the statutes that were to issue it in Roe, it says, whoever furnishes the means for procuring an abortion, knowing the purpose intended, is guilty as an accomplice. That's something not covered by the trigger bill. Therefore, it is not superseded by it. That is an accomplice liability section. So it also not just goes after the doctors, but it's going to be going after those giving rides, supporting it, procuring the means, assisting, anybody that is an accomplice to the procurement of an abortion is also then committing a crime.
And would that include companies as well, too? I know you floated an idea earlier.
Absolutely.
So companies that would pay for their employees to go out of state to get an abortion, that would include them as well.
Yeah, or companies that are paying for, their people to go to have abortions. Yes, I think that is them facilitating or as accomplice liability. That is the goal. That's what I believe it is. And we're going to try it.
Can you get that passed in the legislature?
Well, that's actually the law right now. And I do think the legislature will pass it.
Do you expect many local district attorneys across the state in the 254 counties in Texas to resist the Dobbs decision that came down on Friday?
Absolutely. I expect the urban county DAs to resist it. And that's why we need to come up with alternative remedies. It's like, that is one of the main reasons that we have civil enforcement under the Texas heartbeat bill. We knew that the major urban DAs weren't going to want to enforce these things, so we allowed for civil remedies. And I believe that's another thing we'll look at going forward in the legislature is more civil remedies, not just for after the detection of a heartbeat, but period, whether or not it occurred. Because if it is illegal, DAs aren't prosecuting it, then we need to empower others to enforce the law.
Mr. Chairman, how do you expect the Dobbs decision on Friday to impact the midterm elections in November?
I don't see why it wouldn't be a positive thing. Today, the court reversed one of its most egregious opinions. I hope and believe that it brings and restores trust back into the government.
And just if you could give some idea of how big of a deal this day is for evangelicals, for Christian conservatives, for Republicans who have fought to get Roe versus Wade overturned for the past 40 plus years.
I'll tell you, I'm doing a really good job of keeping my emotions together. I know it's going to be an emotional day for people on both sides. Look, it's literally why I went to law school. I chose to go to law school in order to become an attorney, in order to fight to end abortion. Today's a really, really big day. It's why I got involved in politics.
Mr. Chairman, we appreciate the time, sir.
Take care. Thank you.
Now to that school shooting in South Texas. For 2 days, we watched a special state Senate committee rip off the scab on the Uvalde massacre. Failures by law enforcement made even clearer in those 2 days. So will anyone be held accountable? This morning, the Republican chairman who led that Senate committee. It's Robert Nichols, who represents a wide swath of East Texas from near Dallas to outside Houston. Mr. Chairman, welcome to the program. Thanks for being with us here today. Based on what you heard in the hearings that you led, do you think that the governor, Greg Abbott, should call a special session?
That's always the prerogative of the governor. Until you know exactly what you're going to do and feel like you have a pretty good consensus of the members to accomplish what we feel needs to be effective, there's really not a reason to call a special session. Obviously, that's the prerogative of the governor, but you've got the House working on it. You've got the Senate members working on it, and trying to see what we can come up with and see if we can get a consensus.
We all watched the hearings over the last few days. What kind of recommendations do you expect will come from your committee?
Too early to say. We know it's going to be spread out over several different things. School safety, obviously there's things we have identified that we believe we have a consensus, things that need to be fixed, but we'll be finding out if we have a consensus over the next several weeks. And in mental health, there's always improvements as well. And police training, it kind of covers the whole gamut of it.
We heard Colonel Steve McGraw from DPS, the director of DPS there too, and he had some of the most compelling testimony. One of the things he said, there were 91 state troopers there. 7 local police officers. DPS has more training. They have more jurisdiction, obviously, Senator. Why wasn't DPS in charge of this active shooter?
I can only speculate based on the facts that I heard. We heard a lot of different law enforcement. We had the Sheriff's Association. We had the Police Chiefs Association. We had the School Officers Association, and they all came and testified, as well as the DPS. And it seemed to be the consensus from what we heard from the testimony was that all law enforcement, they work with the ones who were there first, who have the most information, the ones they think are in charge. Because if you're the second or third or fourth person to arrive at the scene and are not aware of the circumstances, well, then you can do sometimes more harm than good. That is the testimony that we heard pretty consistently all the way through.
Do you expect that anyone is going to be held accountable for the law enforcement failures that we watched?
My job is not to place blame. And that is
but as a state legislator, you're a veteran state legislator. I mean, you've seen these things. What do you think? Do you think someone is going to be held accountable, or do you think someone should be held accountable?
I think the parents don't really care. They lost their loved ones and they've got a big hole in their heart right now. And I think that's all they're focused on. And there's a lot of other outsiders who are trying to point blame and a lot of finger pointing in different directions. No one wants to be responsible for what happened. Ultimately, the person that was responsible was a shooter. He's no longer with us. That's the one who's really should be held accountable. There's a breakdown in the system. We pointed that out. You've got mental health, you've got school safety, you've got police training, all those different categories. Basically, we as a system from the state, we failed Uvalde. We did. It might have been a small crack, but it was a very violent one. And what we're trying to do is identify what we can do to make it better.
Mr. Chairman, we appreciate your time, sir.
All right. Thank you very much.
Between Uvalde and abortion, lots to discuss next on the Roundtable.
This is Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley.
Time now for Reporters Roundtable to put the headlines in perspective. I am Mitra, back with us from Austin at the Texas Tribune. Bud Kennedy is here each week from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and Bernadine Steptoe, political producer at WFAA in Dallas, joins us for this segment as well. Ian, let's start with you. Politically speaking, which political party really benefits from the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade?
Well, I think when it comes down to the campaign in November ahead of the election, I think both parties will be using this. I don't think this is going to go away. I think Democrats will use this as saying that this is clear evidence that we need to to win back more reps and try to do more. And I think the Republicans will say, like, we're not done yet. This is the start of something. So both, I don't see either party kind of letting off. I think both will use this, as much as they can.
And Bud, I think about Wendy Davis. Abortion doesn't really do too well in this state when it comes to Democrats. How did Democrats handle this?
Abortion doesn't move the needle with voters, but this time now the loser always gets more motivation. So Democrats will be the party that gets more motivation out of this. For Republicans, it's kind of like the end of a college football game where time is running out and they're lateraling the ball around trying to get one last play in. Republicans are trying to convince their voters that the ball is still in the air, the game's not over, they need to keep coming back out and vote.
Bernadine, do you think at the end of the day this energizes or demoralizes Democrats?
Well, I think it can energize because they can show that, okay, with the Republicans in control, your rights can be taken away from you because, you know what, something that's not talked about as often is the platform of the Republican Party of Texas, and they're talking about doing away with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So they're talking about a lot of things. It just depends upon how the Democrats spin this and put their candidates out front.
And let's switch off, Bud, to the Uvalde massacre and the Special State Senate Committee that we heard from last week. There's a lot of finger pointing, obviously, between DPS and officials. The Uvalde mayor says, blames the state and is tangling with them as well too. Roland Gutierrez, the state senator who represents the area, but he even sued the state, sued DPS because he can't get documents related to this. Why, a month later, are we not getting clear answers on this?
You know, it's because the DPS has become a political agency, and we've seen that Colonel McCraw, this is a far cry from the days of Colonel Spear or the days of the Texas Rangers, one riot, one ranger. This was the day that the tradition of Texas law enforcement died, of going in and getting things done. And this was a day that the DPS tradition died as well. He needs to talk about that.
Bernadine?
You know what? It is strictly politics, and apparently what they're not wanting to put out there and release doesn't do well for the Republican Party because they're the ones who are in control. But obviously someone is not going to look well in this aftermath. Nobody actually does. But I don't think it's going to play well for those elected officials who don't want it out there.
Well, and that's my inclination as well, too. When something's not being released, the reporter in me says, all right, what are you hiding here? State Senator Roland Gutierrez says he thinks that the body cams on the state troopers are just going to show absolute chaos. Do you think this will be an issue in November?
This could be an issue, and also it's going just back to a community that's still in mourning and grieving and just wanting to move forward. They want answers more than anything about what happened, just so we can move on from this. And I think that's really ultimately, that's the saddest part about this, is that people who really need answers as they grieve and mourn aren't getting what they need.
Indeed so. Guys, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you for watching as well. We're back again next Sunday to take you inside Texas politics. Until we see you then, hope you have a great week. Take care.